this is the best of times, this is the worst of times. That's all the United States. We are a manic depressive country. A manic depressive country in that at times the entire society believes that it's a failure. At some moments the entire society believes it will transcend all limits of humanity. And other times there's a great disagreement over who's the devil and who's the saint. We've lived through these periods. Each time we live through the period, it is the worst of times, and cannot ever be worse. And each time we get through the period is the best of times. To understand the American regime is to understand that it's an invented country, an invented society, an invented people. It is an artificial nation, unlike France, unlike Russia, unlike China, which has deep roots in history. We invent and reinvent ourselves constantly. We're a nation where almost no one came here because they wanted to. It's a nation of failures. If you're doing okay back home, you didn't want to go out into the wilderness or slum to live. It brings a certain sort of person here. This person is an adventurer. A person is a risk taker. The person is filled with despair. How could he not be filled with despair? He's left everything he's known behind. I was born hungry. Hungry, an Hungarian Jew. I was born after the war, but my parents' life was filled with nothing but memories of horror. Of who didn't die and who did die and who almost died. And yet they longed for it. They came and they lived here and they wanted the streets of Budapest. That's who we are. George Washington's great-grandfather was a royalist. He was a don at Oxford University. For a moment, the Protestants were winning. And so he had to leave. They confiscated all of his property. And he came here because there was nowhere else to go. And he bought land, and he wanted to be an English nobleman, so he built an estate. And he couldn't have serfs, so he had slaves. He recreated a life. George Washington, his great-grandson, was called to fight in the French and Indian Wars in the Appalachian Mountains. And while he was there, he was a lieutenant colonel at the age of 25. And his commanding officer was Braddock, who had nothing but contempt for him and all others. And it was at that moment, that generation discovered they were not Englishmen. They were Americans. They were Americans not because they chose to be Americans, but because they were cast out by the English. It was that generation that signed the Declaration of Independence. So when we look at the founding of America, we see a nation that was founded in deep despair. George Washington was born thinking he was English. I was told by General Braddock he was a barbarian. So think of the anger in the room when they declared independence. It's always reenacted in an interesting way with everybody calmly talking. John Adams never spoke calmly, and Thomas Jefferson never listened to anyone calmly. It was a room full of passionate men filled with despair of what they had been, uncertainty as to what they would become, and with only one desire, to be better than the English. This is who we are. We are not a peaceful nation. We're not a contemplative nation. Nor are we a nation that trusts. We emerged from the English Civil Wars. We emerged from the Irish potato famine. We emerged from the failing economies of Poland. We emerged from the Holocaust. Our past is one of failure and horror. Each moment we fear may slip away. Each moment we fear may be the last. We're a nation that is constantly looking at apocalyptic things. I remember when the world's population was going to rise so rapidly that by 1970 there would be nothing to eat but each other. It didn't happen, but we had the apocalyptic moment. When we go through American history, we talk of great awakenings. There are also moments of continual apocalypse, whether for the French or the English. So this is who we are. We go through these periods, and it's in these periods that great inventions take place. It's in this period that the founders conceived of the notion of the pursuit of happiness as a right. It's in this moment that we invent the air forces, the aircrafts that fly today. It's in these moments. It's not the good times where extraordinary things emerge. It is instead the tenuous times, times of uncertainty. And it's also at that time that we get enormous political struggle. I was at CCNY, I couldn't afford Columbia. I was at CCNY the day Martin Luther King was killed. I didn't listen to the radio, I didn't know he was dead. So I took the subway, went to 135th Street, and decided to walk up to the school. A very fine African gentleman told me, "Get the hell out of here, you idiot." I wasn't sure why, but I was leaving. This was the time when Martin Luther King was killed, Robert Kennedy was killed. The 82nd Airborne went into Detroit to pacify it. The Chicago Convention turned into absolute riots, which were extraordinary. There was Kent State. And finally, we had a president who was unambiguously a criminal. So, ambiguous. But this one was unambiguously superior. And we thought at that time that this was the worst of times. I remember I had a girlfriend. I rarely had one, but occasionally one was silly enough to hang out with me. I had a girlfriend who I went with, and we were walking around St. Patrick's Cathedral right after Robert Kennedy was killed. And I normally don't have feelings, but I had this feeling of enormous loss, not for him, frankly, but for the country. This is what we've become. And it seemed inconceivable that we could reconstruct ourselves. During the Great Depression, we forget the hunger, the loss. We forget the dust bowl that swept the center of the country, leaving our agricultural community, our farmers, bereft of all hope. We go back to Jackson, but I won't take you back that to Jackson. There's no need. The point I'm making in my book, which is the storm before the calm, is that neither is this new nor is it random. There's an orderliness to the way this emerges. There are cycles at work. There's an institutional cycle. Every 80 years we have a war and it changes our institutions. We first built a nation consisting of states without defining what the federal government does. We had a conference at Gettysburg, lasted 3 days, and it was decided that the states are subordinate to the federal government. We had World War II, when the American economy was nationalized, and it was determined that the federal government had a right to govern the economy and the society, to determine how we lived, something that has not gone away. Each of these, for reasons I cannot fathom, but it's true, was 80 years apart. Now, we are just now 80 years closing in on the cycle. II ended, we created a state which is deeply enmeshed in all aspects of society. It can't be conceived of otherwise. And yet there's a sense of failure of that system and of the republic. We're also in the middle of an economic crisis. Well, we always have those, except when we have booms. The crisis of the Roosevelt era was that the factories were completely functional, but no one could buy the goods. And because no one could buy the goods, people were laid off. And no more people could buy the goods. The solution was to get money in the hands of these people so they could buy things and get the factories going again. Seems like a good idea. Roosevelt couldn't quite do it. Hitler did. Hitler and the Japanese managed to get everybody back to work and started a boom of extraordinary proportions. And all technologies that were developed during World War II fueled our lives. At a certain point, the amount of credit that was being issued to buy consumer goods created massive interest rates. I bought my first house at 18%. Okay. Inflation rates of 10 to 12% and unemployment 10%. The period had run its course. The problem now was a lack of capital. We didn't have investment capital. And the president was elected and he didn't even know what he was doing any more than Roosevelt did. And he said, you have to have more investment capital. And he came along with the idea, this voodoo economics of let's put money in the hands of rich people, because they don't consume it, they invest it. And this was a horrible thought for everybody else, just as everybody was offended at Roosevelt's un-Americanism, so they were offended at the lack of compassion of Reagan. And it was in this period that it worked. There was investment capital, so that the inventions, the ideas, and the thoughts that were coming out of the system could be funded. The most extraordinary thing about this period, presenting now, is the vast amount of money that was available and the vast amount of money and ideas that were there. So much of them flowing out of the federal government. You know, people who oppose socialist government really don't like the microchip or the internet or anything else that was developed. But the point was, we exhausted this period, and now we've reached a point where there is surplus money so that I can't retire. There's no way to get interest, and nothing to invest in. Now here we have to talk for the moment about where the technology comes in. I had started by saying America is an invented country. We invented the regime, we invented the people, we even redefined the entire geography, because our first technical events were canals. And the Erie Canal redefined the relationship between the East Coast and the interior. We invented this. So we proceed in every moment with this process of invention, backed up by risk takers. And worked, and the last one worked beautifully. Because the microchip, which I have kind of as a symbol of the core technology that transformed the world, created such gains in productivity, such gains in wealth, not just concentrated, although increasingly concentrated at the end. It transformed everything. So the first time we had a core technology, of course, canals were one, electricity was the other. Yet a third was the internal combustion engine. Each of these came to be because we needed them. Once we had the Industrial Revolution in America, once we had cities, and factories had to be close together for the supply chain to work, the city had to be able to function at night. And Thomas Edison, among his many inventions, invented this. He was an inventor. He was also a marketer. Not in the sense that he pitched the stuff, he didn't have to, but he understood what was needed next. And he built this machine out in New Jersey, of all places, New Jersey, where he cranked these things out, identifying what was needed and tasking people to invent them. Well, in due course, electricity turned from a marvel, which turned the night into day, which made it possible to go and hear the symphony 30 miles away on an electric train at night in the cold. And it became a commodity. We take it for granted. We don't even notice it. It's no miracle, as it should be. But the stress and strain of the social system as it adopted this was enormous. It had to be there. The automobile redefined the geography of where it was possible to live. It made the suburbs possible. Not many sneer at the suburbs. I've heard Bob Seger's song. But when we bought our first little house in Queens, it was a moment of redemption. So those who lived there didn't know they were living in shallow, superficial places. They thought they were escaped a two-bedroom apartment in the Bronx in the summer. So when we look at this, we had the automobile come, and it was, first factory was really put in 1915. By 1965, it was a commodity. It's a mature thing. I remember when I was a kid, every year they'd have a new model. Nobody wants a new model anymore. Nobody knows what model you're driving. It's a commodity. It is not an affirmation of who you are. It's a car. Now the problem we have today is this. The microchip technology is not high-tech. It was high-tech. But it's now 50 years old. I remember at Cornell standing and I had the HP handheld computer in my hand, handheld calculator that they wanted $200 for. I had no idea what I was holding in my hand. The transformation of human thinking. And so the microchip drove productivity, and the investors got 10 times returns, 10 daggers, we call it. And the economy drove itself forward out of World War II, out of the first recovery from the hyperinflation, into a new wealth, a new progress. And for a time, it seemed that anything was possible. And we are now struggling with the fact that the microchip has become a commodity. You can no longer, each year at Apple, produce a new telephone and have everybody pay $200 more to have it. I have a telephone. I still wish I'd have my BlackBerry. I think the BlackBerry is the height of all phones. It did one thing. It made phone calls. But you had the effect of the car. The car became something to get you from one place to another, to have dates on a Saturday night, to race. It became far more than what it was intended for. To manage that, it became far more. So what did we wind up with? We wound up in a crisis because as the microchip matured, the rate of return on each new innovation declined. As each new innovation declined, more desperate attempts were found to something we need that we don't have. And as we reached this point, productivity growth collapsed. In 1980, 2009, 10, 11, 12, productivity went from 2-3% a year growth to flat to 1%. Why? Because this was now a mature commodity. It was just done. And we're America, and when we're done, we're done. And when we're done, we scream. So if you don't think they screamed at Reagan or screamed at Roosevelt, I mean, it was operatic. The best of times and the worst of times. And then we entered the Concord moment. The Concord moment is the one in which you say, a DC-3 got me to London in 20 hours. A DC-6 got me there in 12. The DC-8 got me there in 6. So certainly people will pay ridiculous amounts of money to get you there in 3 hours. And they hit the wall. They built the Concorde and no one came. Because there's a limit to what I want from you guys, right? So they built it. I remember when, 1965, they built the first car that could also be a boat. A friend of mine bought it. So it was fun. We all enjoyed it. But remember, you're taking a technology and pushing it to its limits. You're desperately looking for a new market. Where Edison just relaxed and said, okay, how many different ways can I parse electricity? Now the question, how many different ways can I parse microchips? Or the technology? The answer is not much. I mean, certainly we've beaten the internet to death. There are good things you can do, there are bad things you can do. It's not the Redeemer. It has not created a new sort of human being that deals in peace with each other. It's built on a crazy place. Okay. What are you going to do next? Artificial intelligence. How do you create an artifice of something you don't understand? I don't understand intelligence. I don't understand how I think. My wife certainly doesn't understand how I think. But in not understanding how I think, how can I make it? You can make more powerful programs. You certainly will. You can make programs that are somewhat separable. But solve the problem of thought? I mean, even Plato couldn't do that. He was pretty snappy. So how would you do this? What is the next big thing? And we developed this idea. Why don't we make a car fly? Or be a boat. Then we can do all sorts of things. Why don't we make an airplane that goes in 3 hours to London? Then we can do that. This is the point that we always reach with technology. It is a point that is parallel to an economic problem. Our core economic problem is there is way too much money in circulation. Interest rates cannot sustain planned retirement, and this is a crisis. Universities are financing themselves by borrowing. They've borrowed $1.6 trillion, larger than the subprime debt. Okay, so we have this strange combination of low interest rates, and I guess not so strange, high borrowing. What else are you going to get when money is cheap? And at the same time, you have a crisis that there's not enough to invest in. I wish I had invested in Microsoft. You know, so stupid. My entire investment record is a stupid stand-up. And the stupidest things are what I didn't do. What I did do was also bad, but these are really stupid. But there are no Microsofts. There are no 10 baggers. The guy who had the office space turned out to be a complete zebra. Uber hasn't made any money, but any day now. We're all inventing the past. So we are in an economic crisis. In the meantime, the decline, the rise of this crisis, the rise of this time of where Microsoft solved a problem, has created another dilemma. The industrial working class has been smashed. It made no sense to invest in things that Japan or China could make much cheaper. Left behind was a vast industrial working class that had been middle class. Now no longer is. The median income of the lower middle class, what I would solid lower middle class, is now $35,000 a year. It goes below that, but $35,000 a year. That's take-home pay in most states, $2,600, $3,000 in Texas. So they are making that much money. You can't buy a house. You can barely buy a car. My parents took me to Rockaway, which you guys may know of. It used to be a nice place. They're not going to go to Rockaway. They're desperate. They are, Hillary Clinton's deplorables. They really appreciated hearing that. And she shouldn't have done it 4 days before the election. They keep fishing for why they just barely lost the industrial Midwest. She called them deplorables, which is the same thing that Braddock did to Washington. So you get anger, you get rage, and you get politicians who know how to take advantage of them. And who are answered with contempt. They're angry. So Roosevelt knew how to take care of his position. And the contempt that Hoover hurled at him, Hoover's followers hurled at him, strengthened him. And they never understood why he beat Landon. Because you attacked him, and everybody hates you. That's why. This was the story. I mean, what happened with Reagan was all the contempt that was heaped on him was by people who couldn't afford 18% houses and inflation rates of 10%. If you think he's a jerk, I like him, because you're the acid us into this. And this is the great process that goes through. So we're now in the process of the Democratic Party trying to grasp the fact that they're as hated as Reagan is. Since they don't know anybody who supports Reagan, never talked to him, they don't understand the mutual hatred that has emerged, which can lead to very ugly places and will lead to even uglier places than we've been. But then we come to the next moment of invention. And it's almost impossible to tell what it is. So I'll guess. The biggest problem that we have going forward is demographic. Old people are living longer. Goddamn right. And young people aren't having babies. Which means that in around 20 years, we're going to outvote the young and tax the hell out of them. So what is it that we really need? What is the problem of our healthcare system? It's very simple. People living longer, but the diseases aren't being cured. They're living on Parkinson's and the maternal diabetes and the prostate and everything's falling apart. But they're living. And ethically, they have to be paid for. The last 10 years of your life, last year of your life, costs 90% of all you consume. So what is the next technology that's needed? Well, we needed the Erie Canal. We needed the automobile. We needed electricity. And we needed the microchip. Now we need a medicine that allows us to live longer and not be so damn sick that we're going to suck up all the wealth of society. Now, Warren hasn't thought of this, but it's the thing we need. Here's the problem. Not a single politician can solve this. Some guy who didn't get a date on Saturday night is sitting in his lab right now, trying to figure out how to do this. Not because he has any dreams of solving any problems, but he really cares about this. And it will be, because we are a nation that invented itself, and the one thing we do well is invention. And when one invention runs its course, we go through this horrible period, and then some guy comes along and cooks up a brand new scheme. Now, am I right in this? I don't know. Yes, I'll invest in it. I'll lose my money. That part of the cycle is given. You know, I'm no longer dreaming that I can outguess it, but I do understand that the hatred at this moment comes from class, the industrial class, that was the center of gravity of the Democratic Party in the New Deal coalition, and is now the deplorables. on the other side, a vast new class that has emerged, so-called technocrats, that have transformed the landscape of our society. And a class that doesn't want to transform, wants it back the old way, and can't get it back. And the other class that says, having done this, I should now get a mass Nobel Prize because I'm done. And so you have a political crash like we had before. At the moment of transformation, the class that loses will rise up and take the class that's winning by the throat and use the political system to throttle it. They'll fail. And in retrospect, it will be fun to watch. But we are now at the moment when these two classes are facing each other. The enmity personally isn't that deep. The desperation is. Remember the desperation that created America. The desperation of the Midwestern steelworker, okay, whose pension has been lost by a company that could never fail, General Motors. Do you expect them to go quietly into that dark night? So they aren't, but their children will confront. And so we have two classes clashing over the end of one era and awaiting the next, while not believing it will come. And so American history will go on, and we will all be filled with the highest sense of righteousness we can feel, self-righteousness. I'm right, you're wrong, and evil. So, standing aside from this, I live in Hayes County, Texas. Hayes County, Texas is filling up with billionaires from Boston. And it's still full of old ranchers who want to shoot me. And I'm sitting there in the middle and saying, I'm not Jewish. My wife's from Australia, I just look Jewish. Leave me alone. But in that anger between them, in the contempt, there lies the future, which is hard to believe, but go back into our history and watch the election of Andrew Jackson, who makes it possible to settle the Louisiana Territory. His wife's a prostitute. He's a criminal. He should be hung. And they stole the 2024 election when John Quincy Adams, the worst president in American history, took it into the House of Representatives and hijacked it. It was quite a scheme. Our politics are like that. And unless you have an understanding both of the political and the economic and the technological and how they fit together, it will look to you as if we are at the moment of catastrophe. No, we should be at the moment of sex. Catastrophes later. And then it was the worst of times. But we got the best of times. And this is how we as individuals developed. This is how the Republic developed. And it's called the United States. And none of you are here, except the one of your great-great-grandparents or somebody came here because he was a total loser at home. Why else come? And now he's left you a trust fund that'll take you care forever. Thank you.